Hi everyone, this is Julie from the Yuma Main Library. Thank you for joining me for this presentation celebrating the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, which granted women the right to vote. While the anniversary commemorates the efforts of the national women's suffrage movement, there are several states that allowed women the right to vote years before the 19th Amendment had been passed. Arizona was among those states. So today I want to share how the women of Arizona were able to gain full voting rights right at the beginning of Arizona's statehood in 1912. The suffrage movement in the West truly began after the end of the Civil War, during the Reconstruction era. The abolition of slavery had sparked national discussions about citizenship and voting rights. In addition to that, new territories were beginning to seek statehood and were drafting their state constitutions. Many women's rights advocates viewed the young governments of Western states and territories as the perfect opportunity to introduce and experiment with political reforms, women's suffrage among them. This illustration symbolizes the awakening of the women's desire for voting rights and how suffrage was first gained in the western states. In Arizona, women shared the work of homesteading and building the new communities of the territory. Since population density was so low in these new western territories, women had to do the same farming and ranch work as men. Many Arizona women were participating in public life by working outside of the home in order to help supplement their family's income. In 1900, about 43% of the female labor force in Arizona were married women, compared to the national average at the time only reaching just over 15%. Arizona also led the West in the number of widows. Arizona's early economy was dominated by the mining industry, and due to its dangerous nature, work in the mines left many men injured or dead. A 1910 census data table shows that about 10.5% of Arizona's female population was widowed, which left many of the women as heads of households and primary wage earners for the family, furthering women's independence. The women of Arizona also enjoyed more liberal property laws since Arizona was governed by community property laws that gave ownership of all property acquired in marriage equally to husband and wife, and allowed married women and widows to control their own property. As property owners, women had to pay taxes, so suffragists argued that denying women the right to vote would be taxation without representation. Therefore, the women of Arizona were in a unique position to argue for voting rights. In Arizona, the women's suffrage movement really gained support with the rise of the temperance movement. Since most early women's suffrage supporters were primarily interested in using the vote to limit alcohol consumption in the territory and eliminate the influence of saloons in western towns. The Arizona chapter of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, a national women's organization devoted to social reform, worked to pass anti-liquor legislation, but lacked the political power to fully eradicate the influence of saloons in Arizona's towns. Josephine Brawley Hughes, a suffrage leader and president of the Arizona chapter of the WCTU, believed that women needed to gain suffrage in order to move the temperance movement forward. With the help of Laura M. Johns, a National American Women's Suffrage Association field organizer from Kansas, Hughes tried to convince Arizona political leaders to include women's suffrage in the state constitution during Arizona's first bid for statehood in 1891. However, when put to vote, the effort would be met with a sound defeat of 16-5 votes. Despite this defeat, the women of Arizona would continue to campaign for women's suffrage, taking on more aggressive campaign strategies with the help of organizers from the National American Women's Suffrage Association. Under the leadership of Frances Willard Muntz and Pauline O'Neill, the women's suffrage movement in Arizona experienced renewed interest and support. The National American Women's Suffrage Association recognized the efforts made by the women in Arizona to achieve voting rights and sent the organizers' chairman, Carrie Chapman Catt, to the territory in 1899 to offer support in the local women's campaign. The Prescott, Arizona Weekly Journal Miner printed an article about Catt's arrival in Phoenix and the purpose behind her visit. Catt, O'Neill, and Muntz expanded the movement to reach out to laborers and the working class. They organized parades, outdoor speeches, and rallies to attract the attention of Arizona's large working class, and aligned the women's suffrage movement with the interests of the growing labor movement. What was most unique about Arizona's women's campaign was the use of controversial tactics such as state politicians blocking other bills in order to force the legislature to vote on a suffrage bill. This would lead to a suffrage bill passing both houses of Arizona legislature in 1903. However, it would be defeated by a veto by Governor Alexander Brody due to what he claimed were constitutional issues. Arizona suffragists would find another opportunity to write women's suffrage into the state constitution at the Second Arizona Constitutional Convention. By 1909, the population of Arizona had grown large enough to be considered for admission as a state. Arizona suffragist leaders recognized that this was the opportune time to revitalize the campaign for women's suffrage, as it would be easier to win the vote as a new constitution was written than to amend an existing one. Frances Munns and the other suffragist leaders learned from their defeat in 1903 and ran aggressive campaign tactics such as engaging in partisan politics and trading votes. The movement aligned itself with the new Labor Party created by Arizona voters who supported the labor movement in order to gain delegates at the Constitution Convention that were more sympathetic and supportive of women's suffrage. Under the advice of national suffragist leaders, the movement also engaged in the suppression of the Mexican American vote. There was a common belief from Arizona suffragists that the average Mexican American male would not support women's suffrage and viewed them as uneducated and ignorant voters. The Arizona Equal Suffrage Association helped the labor unions and Democratic Party pass a literacy test requirement in 1909 to limit the Mexican American vote. The women of Yuma County were not missing during the many campaigns for women's suffrage and the ratification of the 19th Amendment. Local newspapers documented their participation in women's clubs and organizations that were responsible for educating and recruiting supporters. A representative of the National American Suffrage Association, Miss Laura Gregg, visited Yuma and delivered a lecture in hopes of inspiring local interest in the suffrage movement. Yuma women even organized the Vote for Women Parade in 1919 to advocate for the inclusion of the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Despite all the suffragettes' efforts, the movement would once again be met with defeat at the Constitutional Convention. The delegates feared that including women's suffrage in the state constitution would hurt Arizona's chances for statehood. Arizona would gain statehood without passing a women's suffrage bill on February 14, 1912. The suffragettes would lobby the new state legislature to put the initiative to a public vote shortly after, only to lose by one vote in the Senate. By this point, Frances Munns had lost faith in the state legislature and began circulating a suffrage initiative petition to get it on the November ballot. She only had 6 weeks and limited local resources to collect the necessary 3,342 signatures. However, by the July 5th deadline, the suffragettes would have collected more than 4,000 signatures. After decades of campaigning, the women of Arizona would finally win full voting rights on November 5, 1912. 68% of Arizona voters supported the amendment, which was the largest popular vote for suffrage in the nation. The overwhelming success of Arizona's campaign stunned national suffrage organizations because they expected the initiative to fail due to lack of resources. But this last campaign benefited from the pro-labor progressive climate in Arizona politics and well-organized campaign by women who had appealed to the many interests of the new state. It wouldn't be until the 19th Amendment passed by the U.S. Congress on June 4, 1919, and ratified on August 18, 1920, that women all across the nation would gain the right to vote. But Arizona was one of the first states to pave the way to full suffrage for women. If you're interested in learning more about the women's suffrage movement, check out our catalog. There are many titles available through our physical and digital collections. Once again, thank you for joining us in the celebration of the 100th anniversary of women gaining the right to vote.